Hello and welcome to this opening exploration video. And by request, I'm going to revisit the Scandinavian defense, but I'm going to take a look at the modern variation. So the Scandinavian defense begins with e4, and then black responds with d5 here, moving this pawn and attacking immediately white's pawn in the center. So white has to decide what to do. And it looks like most often white captures, and that's probably the best move, is to just go ahead and capture this pawn. So after capture, now a lot of times the queen can capture, but today we're going to look at the modern variation of the Scandinavian defense where the knight jumps forward, developing, and adds pressure to this pawn here. So if I go back one move and look at this, the main move by almost 30,000 moves is for, or excuse me, 30,000 games is for the queen to capture here. But second, with almost 14,000 games, is for the knight to develop. And that's what we're going to look at. This is the modern variation. So you immediately develop and add pressure along with the queen. So I'll look at the main moves first real quick, and then later, we'll look at the c4 move, immediately protecting the pawn, because that's an option as well. But first, we'll look at the most played move, and moves that are played most often. That usually means that there's a lot of success with those moves, and more of the chess masters out there play those moves. Now, you can pick a few second best or even third best moves in a row and still get a good game, and maybe confuse your opponent a little bit because they won't be as familiar with those other moves. So here, d4 was played most often, and then that allows black to immediately capture with the knight, which is played most. So capture, and then it looks like knight to f3 can be played, and also c4, driving the knight away immediately. So I'll take a quick look at the number one moves to give you an idea of how those might play out, or how opening variations that involve the number one moves, what that will look like. So the number one move for black is g6. Maybe getting ready to fianchetto and add more pressure to this pawn. So immediately c4, the number one move, chases the knight. Now, it looks like knight to b6 is played most often, but knight to f6 can be played as well. But it looks like black only wins 13% of the time and white wins 57% of the time with knight to f6. And that was only played 47 times versus 715. So the number one move, retreat and counterattack this pawn. And then white usually develops his other knight. Bishop develops, and black is ready to castle. So the number one move in this position is to press forward, attacking the knight, and then the knight centralizes. So now we can play bishop to c4, adding more pressure with the bishop and the knight, and only the queen is defending. So black has to make a decision, and here black usually plays c6, fortifying the knight. White castles, as does black. And then rook grabs the half-open file. Then we have bishop to g4. So now we're coming down to where there's only a few examples. So the most played move here is bishop to g5 with 22 games. And after knight to f6, we're down to the number one move only having 6 examples, and white wins more often here. So attack, and the bishop pair is given up here. Queen recaptures. So that kind of helped white develop. And now, in exchange for that, the queen grabs a pawn in the center, but so does black. And now another pawn, I guess, could be captured here, but maybe, is that risky? Perhaps. So now it looks like knight develops because the rook was attacking here. Bishop retreats, and queen does grab this other pawn, attacking the rook. So capture and protecting the rook. Knight captures, and the rook grabs this pawn. So black centralizes, and an attack on the queen here. So the queen steps to the side. All right. Well, I'm not going to go much further, or then it'll become an endgame study. So let me go back and we'll take another look at this opening. So we looked at the beginning of the Scandinavian defense, which is e4, d5, the Scandinavian defense, then capture. Knight adds more pressure. So once again, this is the modern variation. And d4 is most played. So I'll take one more look at these, the moves that you're probably going to see the most. So I'll go over them again here. Knight captures. The bishop could develop to g4, the second most played move. But I don't know. Then I guess you could push forward with this move, if the bishop lands here, and chase the bishop away. All right. Normally you're going to see this capture. Well, then after knight to f3, what did we look at? Bishop to g6. Well, pawn to g6. But bishop to g4, the second most played move. Then you block with the bishop, breaking this pin of the knight on a pin of the knight to the queen. So now e6 allows you to develop your other bishop. White castles, bishop to e7. The knight comes under attack, a recurring theme here. Because you don't have two central pawns, you might as well push this flank pawn, the c pawn. So these two pawns are controlling a lot of central space and squares here. All right, the knight retreats to b6. We could look at this knight to f6 move, so that's a possibility. But then you just develop your knight. Black usually castles, then bishop to e3. And we already see there's only a few examples in this database at this point. Knight usually develops. Finally, you attack this bishop, forcing it to make a decision. After retreat, we have a queen developing off the back rank, connecting the rooks and attacking this unprotected pawn. So the queen steps over, guarding the pawn, and maybe allowing this rook to move over here and try and get some play down the half-open d file. So anticipating that, this rook is moved behind the pawn that has been pushed forward. A lot of times you would think, well, should I put it on this half-open file? But you have two bishops in the way there at the moment. So after this, d5 is usually played, trying to get more or gain more space for this rook that you've put behind the d pawn. So after capture, we have an exchange, and bishop to d6, blocking the path of this pawn, which is isolated now. So another way that the game could progress in this modern defense of the Scandinavian, or modern variation of the Scandinavian defense. All right, so here it looks like white just centralizes the other rook, black centralizes his rook, and then knight jumps forward, unleashing an attack on the bishop. So here, an attack on the queen first. So the queen just steps forward, and then an exchange here. Queen can drop back and capture instead of having to retreat the knight. But this knight jumps forward, queen to f3, and this is a way that the game can go. So that way I can, or so that I can cover more. Let me go back and we'll take a look at a few other lines and variations. Okay, so after capture, knight to f6 once again is the modern variation. Now we looked at d4. Maybe we should look at the second most played move. Bishop to b5. So this would allow, the number one move is blocking with the bishop. You could also block with the knight as well. And it looks like black wins a little bit more with that move because you try and keep your bishop pair. So, I don't know, first I'll look at bishop to d7. Well then, most often played is to just retreat back to e2. You could retreat to c4, so c4 or e2 to keep your bishop pair. I mean, usually there's not a good reason to just give up the bishop pair. So, with that in mind, well, I guess we could take a look at the most played move here. I'll play it a little bit. Knight just goes ahead and captures. This pawn ends up on d4 anyway. Now, let's see, bishop to f5. Knight develops. e6. So now the bishop is outside of this pawn chain. And, it's better to have your bishop outside the pawn chain so it's not blocked in by its own pawns. So white usually castles. Then we have bishop to e7 and black is ready to castle. So a3, keeping this knight from moving forward, maybe attacking here in the future. So black castles. Then we have, once again, the c4 move, attacking the knight. And the knight usually goes to b6. I mean, I guess the knight could go here to f6, but that's not played as much. Black does win a little bit more often, according to this, so with this move. So we'll take a look at it. Knight would just develop, fighting for this square, but most often played is knight moving forward anyway. So black could capture, but then the bishop could recapture. So the most often played move is this, attacking the unprotected pawn. And now, knight takes c3. Excuse me. All right. So here we have a capture, and then b6, preventing the queen from capturing and attacking the rook. And here, knight to e5. The knight jumps up to this outpost, but the knight could be chased away with a pawn push. But instead, black usually just plays bishop to e4. Maybe getting ready to drop back here into a fianchettoed position, while keeping an eye on the center and the king side here. So bishop develops and knight develops here, blocking the path of the bishop. So f3, now the bishop can't retreat back here. So knight to a5 attacks the queen. Queen retreats, and now the bishop is able to go to b7. So interesting maneuver there. Now we have bishop to d3, centralizing the bishop more and aiming at black's king side. So c5, fighting for the center, and f4 gains space. Rook centralizes, and rook to a2 here. Maybe getting ready to double up rooks at some point. Capture, capture, and bishop attacking the knight. So rook at a to f2, doubling the rooks up. g6, f5. Well, that's interesting. I guess you could try and get rid of your pawn here to unleash your doubled rooks. So after capture, whoa, what is this? White wins with a rook sacrifice. Huh. After capture, then the rook captures. Interesting. Something you could take a look at. Now, why did they not, after this pawn capture, I guess it would just be too open for the king. If this pawn were to capture here, then this bishop could recapture, attacking the rook, giving time for the queen to jump up here with a check at some point. And that's just a lot of pressure bearing down on the king. So that's probably why this pawn did not capture the rook. All right, back to the beginning and see what else we can take a look at here. So, once again, capture and knight to f6 is the modern variation. What are other possibilities? We looked at bishop to b5. I could take a look at that again to see what happens if they block with the knight. Well, then c4 just protects the pawn. This drives the bishop away. And so as not to lose, here it looks like you could do either one. You might as well retreat and keep your bishop pair. B5 is played most often. Okay, I see why. You capture, then they can recapture here in the center with this move. Knight attacks and protects the pawn as well. So knight to b6 attacking the bishop. Some interesting stuff here. So yeah, I encourage you to take a look at the Scandinavian defense. Try out this modern variation. See what you think. So we have a pin here. Pinning the knight. So that's ignored in favor of knight to f3. Now the king is ready to castle. So this move is played to keep pieces maybe out of g5. And maybe with an idea of pushing the pawn in the future and starting an attack, but probably not, because the queen side is pretty open now, so the king will probably castle over here. So after castle, we have capture, 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 and d5 attacking the center while the king is still in the middle. The knight comes down trying to knock out the bishop pair, white's bishop pair, and queen to d4 attacking here. So after capture, capture, sticking the king in the center, the king moves forward. Then we have bishop developing. Queen to g8. Interesting play here. Centralizing of the queen. Knight captures. And now check. King to d7. Capture with check. Recapture. And bishop takes b6. Man, yeah, this looks dangerous for black here. The king being stuck out in the open. So, I don't know, this is just another example to help you see some of the things that can happen in this line, in this opening. So, let's take another look at everything. So, capture and knight to f6, the modern variation. Um, I don't know, there's a lot of options here. I'll take a look at the immediate knight to f3. Well, then you have capture, d4, g6, c4, and this is starting to look a little bit like some of the other lines that we looked at earlier. So bishop to g7, black's ready to castle, and once again attack on the knight, centralization, bishop adds to the attack, pawn defends. So this is kind of what we looked at before. So some of these lines can transpose into one another, and after castling, once again you grab the half open file, bishop pins the knight to the queen. So we have a developing of this bishop here to g5, and it's putting pressure along with the rook on this pawn, and the pawn's pinned to the queen. So the knight drops back, and so white attacks. And then after capture, I think we saw all this before. So yes, it allows the queen to capture in the center, but you're able to counterattack here. Although, white wins if you go after this bishop. Okay, you have this possibility, capture, and then what? Capture, and the queen will capture. So knight develops, and I think I actually covered this line in my first introduction video to the Scandinavian defense. All right, let's see what else there is to take a look at. So after capture, knight f6, the modern variation. What else can we look at? We'll go back to the main line because you'll probably see this more often. So, one other thing. Before I do that, let's take a look at this. Trying to hold on to the pawn here immediately. Well, if that happens, it looks like c6 is played most often here. And then, let's say you capture. That's the third most played move. Well, that helps your opponent develop a knight, and now they have two knights developed compared to your none. But the most played move is knight to f3, but black wins 60% of the time from here. So what are the other options? d3 is second, and knight to c3. So looks like d3 loses, black wins the least amount of times if d3 is played. So, I guess we'll take a look at that because it looks like it's more of an even variation. So here e5 is usually played. Then the knight jumps up here. But white wins more often with e2. So let's continue with that. And then bishop to c5. So this is some of what you could see in this variation. I'll have to look at some other lines here after this one. So here we have castling, then h6 is played most by black, and black wins most often with that. Knight to c3, bishop develops, then a3 getting ready to attack on the king side here after pushing this pawn. So a5 slows that down. And now we have white won with this move, attacking the bishop. Bishop retreated. And then we have the other bishop developing here. Queen develops. And bishop takes a7. Rook captures. And now what? Knight back to the center. Rook to d8, lining up on the queen. So knight attacks the rook, We have a rook retreat and then queen to b3 lining up maybe on this pawn, although the queen is protecting it. All right, so another example of how things could play out. Let me go back here and we'll take a look at this again to see what can be done if you're playing black and your opponent just tries to hold this pawn. Well, it looks like c6 is played most often, so we'll take another look at that. They could just play the most common move, which, well, let's take a look at the second most common because that helps fortify this pawn, I guess. Then you're going to have a capture, 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 and now white is left with an isolated pawn here, an isolated queen pawn. And when you have an isolated pawn, you should try and trade off material. But here, if this knight captured, well then it looks like a pawn could recapture towards the center, or even this pawn could capture away from the center, and maybe you have a queen trade. That's a possibility. But that trades down a lot of material and gets rid of this isolated pawn here. So most played move is just developing another piece. Bishop pins the knight to the king. That's ignored in favor of this move, defending the knight. White castles. And then black gets ready to castle as well. And the isolated queen pawn pushes into the center of the board. So after castle, rook developing, bishop develops, and we have, oh no, bishop to d3 is played most often, retreating. Huh. Okay. Rook grabs the open file. Now, knight captures. So, this is an idea, once again, of how things could play out. Now, here, knight to e5 is played. You can't take this pawn, or else there could be a discovered attack, with the bishop capturing with check, and then the queen picking off the knight if the knight captures this pawn. So, that's a little trick to be wary of. Whether if you're playing black or something you could try as white. Okay, bishop to f6. So adding pressure to the knight. Bishop helps defend. g6, that gets rid of that discovered attack possibility. So queen to b3. And now knight to a5 is played most often, attacking the queen. The second most played move, and black won by going ahead and capturing this pawn and attacking the queen. So, I don't know, we might as well take a look at that, because now the queen is under attack, so the queen grabs this pawn. And the queen's attacking this pawn as well. So knight to e6, attacking the unprotected bishop. Bishop attacks the rook. Knight counterattacks the queen. Queen grabs the central pawn, and then we have this attack on the queen. So trade of queens, the rook captures, and bishop back to f1. Man, so a lot going on here. Just shows you, try the Scandinavian defense. You might see some, crazy variations. And after all this, we've transposed into the Caro-Kann defense, accelerated Panov modern variation. So that's something too. You could try the Caro-Kann as black and the Scandinavian defense as black. And sometimes they can transpose into each other, and the pawns kind of sometimes end up on similar squares. So, try out both of those. All right, let me see if there's anything else we should take a look at. capture and knight attacks. This is the modern variation. So I'll take one more look at the main line. So this is probably what you'll see most often. That, and then usually white develops the knight, but you could attack right away, forcing this knight to make a decision. Now, I think the viewer who requested that I do a video on this opening, maybe I played this variation before, and they mentioned playing maybe this. So it was played 212 times. So we can take a look at that. Now, usually knight to c3 is played, so that covers this square, which the knight is attacking. G6 is played most often. Knight develops, bishop develops. So white develops their bishop. Both sides are ready to castle. So after castling by both sides, we have c6. h3, preventing an attack, maybe bishop, limiting the scope of this bishop that could attack our knight. So the bishop develops to f5 instead. Bishop to e3. So common development of the pieces here that you might see. Here we have knight to a6, maybe guarding this or wanting to drop back and reposition towards the center, or even jumping forward here. So a3 was played to prevent that knight from moving forward in the future. So then knight to e4, queen to b3, queen to c8, protecting this unprotected pawn that the queen is attacking. So rook at a to c1, behind the pawn that is pushed forward, and knight captures, queen captures, but now they're lined up. The bishop is lined up on that queen. So rook to d8 adds more pressure to this pawn. Rook at f to d1 helps protect, and knight repositions. So now we have b4, knight to e8, queen to b3, getting out of the line of fire here by that bishop, and the knight moves forward. So knight to e5, grabbing this outpost, and the knight drops back to get rid of the knight. So f4 fortifies the knight, and bishop to e4. Interesting choice here. Bishop pins the knight to the queen. So e6 blocks that. And bishop back to f2. f5. Chasing the bishop away. So then we have maybe an exchange of bishops here. But that's as far as the game went, or as far as I have in this database here. All right. Well, I'll wrap it up with that for today. That just gives you an idea of how the modern variation can be played in the Scandinavian defense, which was, once again, capture and knight developing. Instead of the queen immediately capturing. So maybe I'll do another video that goes more in detail on the main move of the queen capturing here instead of bringing this knight out. But today we looked at the modern variation of the Scandinavian defense. So try it out. Feel free to leave comments and let me know what you think, or if you tried it out, how it worked for you. So also please like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. But thank you for watching and have a super chess day.